Good afternoon and good other time zone to any who are not on the East Coast of the United States. Welcome back to the virtual Wilson Center. I'm Jane Harman, President and CEO, and really delighted to help to host the discussion today about an upcoming HBO documentary called The Perfect Weapon, based on our former Wilson Fellow David Sanger's book of the same name. The title refers to the increasingly sophisticated cyber weapons that our enemies, both state and rogue and non-state actors, have developed, which we are still dismally unable to deter effectively. Let me try that again. The title refers to the increasingly sophisticated cyber weapons that our enemies, both state and non-state actors, have developed and which we are still dismally unable to deter. Think election interference, which is especially pertinent given the fact that a very big election is 3 weeks from today. But I'd like to think the book and documentary title also refer to David Sanger himself, whom I consider the perfect weapon in our arsenal of scholars. I hope he's smiling. Yes, he's smiling. David is our go-to guy on many issues. He's a veteran New York Times reporter for 38 years. Wow, that's pretty old, David.
That's pretty old.
Yeah, currently it's national security correspondent, and he has bolstered our science, technology, and innovation programs focus on the impact of cyber threats on international relations and how they upend the balance of power globally. While we're on the subject of STIP, that's the acronym for our program, I have to give a major, huge shout out to Meg King. It's amazingly competent director. We couldn't do any of this without you, Meg. Even David couldn't, so there, Meg. In recent years, our team has offered hands-on training on cybersecurity and AI to Capitol Hill staff. That means they come actually, and now virtually, to the Wilson Center on Friday afternoons for 3 hours of training in one or the other, and some do training sequentially, one or the other AI course or cyber course. And what do they gain from that? First of all, they get to know each other, which is not happening on Capitol Hill. There are no bipartisan friendships, sadly. But they also bring back the tools that their members need to understand these enormously technologically challenging issues. I've taken the cyber course 7 times, and I'm not up to David, but I actually can string a sentence together. So I'm just saying our tools are very effective, especially for digital natives, less effective for digital adapters like me, but I am trying hard. Before David wrote The Perfect Weapon, he wrote several other books. One, Confront and Conceal, Obama's Secret Wars and Surprising Use of American Power in 2012. And a second, The Inheritance, The World Obama Confronts and the Challenges on American Power in 2009, which he physically wrote at the Wilson Center. So of course, you know what's coming, David. We believe we put you on the map. At any rate, David's latest book is so important that it's now a documentary. This is not a typical event, and we're expecting you, David, but no pressure, to win an Academy Award.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Oh, sure. So today we're going to discuss how nation states compete in cyberspace and why the problem is only getting worse, not better. David, tell us about why you wrote the book at the Wilson Center. And how did you adapt it to be a documentary?
Sure. Well, first, thanks, Jane, and thanks to you, Meg, and thanks for all your support over the years for this whole line of inquiry, academic research, and journalism, and cyber requires all three. And I particularly thanks to Jane, because I know that she is making her way down to her last months running the Wilson Center. Jane loves to start every speech by saying that she's a recovering politician, but soon she'll be saying that she's a recovering CEO of the Wilson Center as well. But Jane, you've done really remarkable things there, including spreading the wings of Wilson to new technology, then something that could not have happened without Meg's great guidance as well. And I've been lucky enough to speak with many of the people who've been going through your training course, the congressional staff and so forth. You asked first, why did I write The Perfect Weapon at the Wilson Center? Because, Jane, one day I was moderating an event for you guys, I think for one of Rob Litwack's books, which he turns out with terrifying frequency. And in the introduction,
My interruption was just that Rob turns out terrifying books with terrifying
frequency. That's true. That's true. And during the introduction, you mentioned my previous two books, the first one of which had been written at Wilson, and you announced that the next book, which was yet unformed, was going to be written at Wilson. So when I started writing it, I just showed up, and what do you know? There was an office and a computer. So thanks very much. The idea of The Perfect Weapon was to try to get people to understand that what initially seemed to many to be a sideshow to our biggest national security problems was actually the main event. And that was actually a huge psychological shift for many people, because they thought, oh, we have our normal, national security crises, and we're worried about whether the Russians are going over the border in Ukraine or threatening Belarus, and whether the Chinese are taking over in the South China Sea and so forth. And yeah, on the side, people are doing a little bit of like information warfare, and they're playing with the cyber stuff. And then something big happened. And it wasn't what our adversaries did to us. It was, of course, what we did to our adversaries. It was Olympic Games, which was the code name for what was probably the most highly classified program the US government had going a decade ago, which was the attack on Iran's nuclear centrifuges. The first time that we had ever used a cyber weapon to try to do by some other means what traditionally we could only do by bombing a facility or sending in saboteurs. It was remarkably successful for a while. The Iranians came back, which taught us a little bit about the temporary nature, in some cases, of limited cyber conflict. But it also did something that President Obama warned his aides in the Situation Room in 2009 would happen, which is when it got out and people understood what we did, every other nation in the world that was attacking us anyway would use it as a justification to ramp up what they've been doing. And as the documentary shows you, that's exactly what has happened. We have seen the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans all come at us. The documentary takes you through the Sony hack, takes you through the Iranians taking out a casino in Las Vegas. Why? Because Sheldon Adelson had suggested dropping a bomb in the Iranian desert, to a nuclear bomb in the Iranian desert, to teach the Iranians a lesson and tell them that Tehran was next if they didn't give up their nuclear program. We take you through what the Russians did in 2016, and then the growth of Cyber Command and what the Americans did back to the Russians in 2018, which leads us, of course, to where we are this week. And on Monday, Nicole Perroth and I reported, as many of you probably saw, that you saw both US Cyber Command and Microsoft and other firms come in jointly but separately. They weren't, either one hadn't coordinated with the other, to attack a botnet called TrickBot, which is used to start up many of these ransomware attacks that we've seen take place in Baltimore, Atlanta, Florida, little towns in Texas, and that the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the NSA all fear could be used on November 3rd to go after registration systems and so forth. So the idea was to try to tie this together, first, of course, for readers of the book, but for those who might not have read the book or read the book and forgotten it or needed an update from it, to take you to the drama of what is happening now in this daily cyber conflict.
I'm recovering myself after listening to this latest set of events and thinking forward 3 weeks to what we might be facing. What we've arranged on this call, David, so that everyone can calm down a bit, and then we'll go back to the hardest questions, is to show a few clips from the documentary. So why don't we show the first clip and discuss that, and then we'll show the second clip, and then if we're all still breathing, then we'll talk about the worst case and the best case going forward. But I mean, speaking for me, again, the digital adapter, you're straining the levels of my competence, but you're not straining the levels of my concern about how not only vulnerable we are, but how vulnerable this world is and unintended consequences and all the rest of it. Okay, so let's show the first clip.
Today, Sony canceled the Christmas Day release of The Interview.
The hackers win. I don't know how else to frame it now that Sony has canceled the release of The Interview, that spoof about North Korea starring James Franco and Seth Rogen.
A couple days later, we were all gathered in our bungalow on the Sony lot, and they were like, there's a press conference coming and Obama's going to talk about it, I think. And I remember we were like, he's not going to talk about it. Like, it was like the first question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Start in North Korea, because that seems to be the biggest topic today. What does a proportional response look like to the Sony hack?
The question at the time was, well, how serious a deal is this? And before you knew it, it was an international security incident that involved the President of the United States.
If North Korea launched a missile into San Francisco, everybody knows what the United States of America, our response would be, right? That's a physical on physical attack. But what is a digital on digital attack, and what is the appropriate response?
John McCain at the time said this is an act of war.
It's a new form of warfare that we're involved in, and we need to react and react vigorously.
President Obama didn't want to go there.
When we were in those conversations, both in the Department of Defense and in the White House, you fear that if you go too hard against the North Koreans, it becomes a real military conflict. The last thing you want is to do something that escalates it, and the North Koreans then hit the U.S. back in our critical infrastructure, right? We didn't know whether they were in the grid and could take something down.
We will respond. We will respond proportionally, and we'll respond in a place and time and manner that we choose. It's not something that I will announce here today at a press conference.
No one really knows what the U.S. government did to North Korea.
There are press reports that suggest that not long after the Sony hack, suddenly North Korea's internet went down. Even if it were the United States government that shut down the internet of North Korea, at the time North Korea had 28 websites. So the United States is far more vulnerable to cyber attacks than many of the countries that are trying to attack us.
The president didn't necessarily have a response to that, to them. And so he chose to talk about Sony.
We cannot have a society in which some dictator someplace can start imposing censorship here in the United States.
He was like, yeah, theater should play it. We shouldn't succumb to these threats. And we were all like, great. But everyone just bailed.
Wow. First of all, I think the production quality is fabulous, and all my friends are in it. So thank you for that. Nice to see them. And then looking around that table, I guess in the Situation Room, I'm not sure where it was, with Obama and everybody else we know, and a guy sitting to Obama's right named Biden, who's in the news lately. It focuses the mind on where we are with this. So David, my first question is, why was it so hard for the Obama administration to figure out what to do here?
Well, it was hard because it was new. And so first of all, Jane, to add to your first at the Wilson Center, I'm not sure that Seth Rogen has ever appeared in a Wilson Center discussion before. So you've broken new ground here. So when the Sony hack happened, as you heard Eric Rosenbach say, in the course of this, there were people who came in and said, this is an act of war, took the McCain position. President Obama said, an act of war? They attacked Sony to stop a Seth Rogen movie, right? So, well, that was certainly an act of sabotage. President Obama referred to it at one point publicly as an act of digital vandalism, which made it sound sort of more like graffiti on the wall. And he later told me he regretted that, that was the wrong phrase. So what was it in the end? What it was an example to the United States of a form of short of war conflict, carefully calibrated to get maximum publicity, do real damage to Sony, which had almost no cyber protections at the time. Sony lost 70% of its computing power in a few minutes after the North Koreans had been rooting around in their system for months. And we were sitting there trying to define what it was rather than think about how we would go deter it. And that actually led to a lot of soul searching later on and helped speed the development of the promotion of U.S. Cyber Command as a major part of the military, now up there with Central Command and Northern Command and all that, because we needed a playbook to go deter all of this. But, in the end, even Cyber Command was focused in the wrong place. It began looking around at these companies, but kept saying, well, we can't defend every company in the United States. If Sony doesn't have any cyber protection, they deserve it. Well, fortunately, the Sony attack led banks and utilities to do more. But, the fact is that U.S. Cyber Command wasn't looking in the right place when the next thing happened, which was the 2016 hack of the election, which was of a very different nature than the Sony hack.
Well, let's go there. I mean, because some of the audience, including me, doesn't have full information on that. Read your book, of course, but it was a few days ago, and hasn't seen the documentary. So I don't think the second clip is about that. If it is, would somebody tell me that it is? Because we're going to show that.
Yep, the second clip. If it's what I think it is, should take.
So then let's not go there yet, because we'll see the second clip and then we'll go there. But do you think, okay, so it was just a movie, which I actually saw, and it was a really bad movie.
Yeah, it's a really bad movie. And
Yes,
if there's anybody in the
sorry.
audience who hasn't seen it, we can now save 2 hours of your life. You can skip the interview and just watch The Perfect Weapon instead.
Yeah, that's right. Watch the documentary, don't watch the movie. But was McCain wrong saying it's an act of war? Was he wrong because it was just a motion picture studio that was attacked? Or, is he necessarily wrong?
He was wrong in that if you call that an act of war, you'd have to call any terrorist activity an act of war, and frequently we don't. He was right to say, hey, look, it's just the point that Will Hurd made in that clip. If the North Koreans had not had access to cyber and they had landed at Long Beach and taken an Uber up to the Sony studio and stuck dynamite underneath the computing center and blown it sky high, and you turned on CNN and you watched the smoking ruins of the Sony studios, with the smoke wafting up over the Hollywood sign, whoever was president of the United States, whether it was Barack Obama or Donald Trump or Joe Biden, they would have had to go make something blow up in Pyongyang. The brilliance of cyber was we spent a month just trying to figure out who did this. And then by the time that time had passed, we were saying, well, can't really make something blow up. It wouldn't be proportional. And that's why it's the perfect weapon.
Yes. Okay. So what would be, there was this unattributed, or it sounds like, attack back. Maybe it's attributed. If it is, it's by you, David, because you know everything about everything. But how should we think about that? I get it. Yeah. Or how did we? And if we, is there such a thing as deterrence if we don't have a kind of a competent playbook?
Well, great question, Jane. So we did two things to the North Koreans. First, we increased some sanctions on them. I doubt that the North Koreans felt that compared to every other sanction we've been putting on them since 1953. Okay, I bet if you stopped North Korean leaders in the street and you said, remember those sanctions that Obama did after the Sony attack? They couldn't even remember which ones they were. The second thing we did was we convinced the Chinese to go in and turn off the North Koreans' access to the internet, all of which at the time ran through China, for a couple of days. My guess is that somebody in North Korea thought they forgot to pay their cable bill. And so I don't think that had much of an impact. The North Koreans now have a second route for the internet. It's through Russia, because they don't want to be entirely dependent on the Chinese. The sanctions didn't amount to much, and it led President Obama, Lisa Monaco, and others to work on new authorities that would enable you to do newer and more robust sanctions. But in the new thinking of US Cyber Command and the NSA, thinking that's happened under the Trump administration, you have to give them credit for this. The concept now is you don't wait to be attacked. You go into adversary networks and you work on these things before you get attacked, because after you get attacked, it's too late. And if you believe what you read in the New York Times, Bill Broad and I reported early in the Trump administration that the US went in during Obama's time and got into the systems that are used to launch North Korea's missiles and led to that 88% North Korean missile failure rate, or at least contributed to it, made their problems worse. Eventually, the North Koreans caught on to this. They brought out a new line of missiles, and they've been much more successful in recent times.
So before we go to the next clip, I want to stick on this issue of deterrence. You've made a point that was also made by another brilliant Wilson scholar named Ben Buchanan, that in order to play defense, you first have to play offense. You have to be in their networks, or either way, in order to understand what they're doing to you, and then to understand what you can do back. And Ben wrote a book, which is also excellent. It hasn't
The
been
Hacker in the
yet.
State. It's great. Yeah.
And the one before that was called The Cybersecurity Dilemma. And the point in that book, see, I actually read things and try to think in my feeble way. The point of the cybersecurity dilemma was, if we're in their network trying to figure out what they're doing to us to defend ourselves, they can think we're attacking. And so that's a real thing too. So do you think, just sticking on this issue of deterrence before we go to the scare ourselves about the election and the Russians, do you think the danger of miscalculation is real here, playing the games that we're playing, or using the tools that they're not games, they're pretty serious?
Yeah, no, it definitely is. As I said at the beginning, everybody's calibrated their attacks so far not to go over that invisible line that would lead you to have B-52s come visit your country, right? If they turned off all the power from Boston to Washington or Seattle to LA, I think the chances that their US would launch a military response is pretty high.
Yeah.
If you just get into the trading systems or turn off the ATMs for financial institutions, as the Iranians did in 2012, or you try to get into the control system of a dam in Westchester County, as the Iranians did at the same time, they've been indicted by the US. By the way, as a kid, I used to play on that dam, and I could have told the Iranians if they had bothered to call and ask that there's no water behind it, but they never asked. If you do all those things, you are guessing that you're not going to trigger that military response. Sooner or later, someone's going to misguess. And they're counting on us to underreact. And you know what? We underreacted to Sony. We underreacted to the Iranian attacks on the financial institutions. We underreacted to the Russian intrusions into the White House, Pentagon, email systems, the State Department systems, and so forth. And so what did Vladimir Putin think? Well, if they're not going to defend the White House email system, they're sure is not going to care about the Democratic National Committee, which, as you remember, Jane, from your long ago days as a politician is basically run by college kids, right? And you know what? He turned out to be right. So we do have to raise the price, but the trick is to do it in a smart enough way that you don't simply get yourself onto a chain of escalation that you're never going to get off.
And I agree with that, and I want to see the second clip, but what's the difference between proportional response to cyber attacks, which can, as you pointed out, if they take down the electric grid in 2 or 3 cities or something, be as deadly as conventional attacks and conventional attacks? Why isn't a cyber attack an improved version of a conventional attack?
It can be, because they can blur, right? So if I wanted to go take out America's nuclear arsenal, I could try launching missiles against it, but I know what the result would look like 60 minutes later. It'd be a lot smarter to try to get into the command and control system so that when somebody pressed that big red button, nothing happened. And that's an increasing danger as we take an aging, largely analog nuclear arsenal and we update it to the digital age. You can introduce those vulnerabilities. If I wanted to go as an American military planner, think about what I'd do to Iran if we got into a conflict with Iran, you might think about a conventional bombing campaign, or you might think about Nitro Zeus, which was the code name for the program that General Nakasone put together before he was even running the NSA, when he was down running Army Cyber and so forth, which basically called for turning off the power in Tehran before you ever had to go bomb anything. Now, would people die when you turn off the power in Tehran? Absolutely. People in hospitals, people who are shut in, people who are the most vulnerable. But the theory of the case, right or wrong, is you wouldn't kill as many people as you would in a bombing campaign. I'm not sure necessarily, depending on the attack, that that's the right way to think about it.
Well, you know, let's just focus sadly on how many people are dying from this pandemic, and before we decide how people die and how many people should die and all the rest of it. I just would observe, as someone who has spent a lot of time in fancy conversations about our defense capacity, that we are still focused on legacy systems and conventional war when the new real war is exactly what you're talking about.
That's right. And there was a great report, bipartisan report, rare bipartisan report that came out from the House 2 weeks ago, led by Jim Hines and Seth Moulton, that basically argued we ought to be investing in these emerging technologies and get the money by killing off legacy systems.
Totally agree. Of course, I no longer represent a district that built, you know, first in class one-offs in the intelligence satellite business, and we do need satellites. But I am saying that the right answer for winning the next war, or deterring, let's start there, the next war, is to think about the role technology plays. And it's not these dirty old, you know, I won't even name the systems since many of them I voted for, but I'm saying we've got to think anew. And I'm delighted about that report. I heard that discussed. It's very exciting that the House produced that. You know, I commend the authors. I also commend Nakasone, who I think is bringing real strength to both.
He's brought a huge amount of new thinking to it, and a really interesting profile of him that Garrett Graff published in Wired today, that everybody interested in Nakasone should go read.
Well, David, since I read everything you write, you're responsible for sending me other stuff so that I can be smart enough to at least appear on a stage with you. Okay, we are going to clip number 2.
The Internet Research Agency, LLC, is basically a building in St. Petersburg with a bunch of trolls sitting there trying to drive divisions in U.S. society. It's existed for years and years at this point, and they've done propaganda work in Russia, in Ukraine, and the like. The IRA specifically sent people to the United States to study the political sphere in the U.S. and to understand what the pressure points were, So in 2016, they were creating these fake American personas and then running ads as political groups. The depth of the content was surprising. Our assumption was that all of this content would be on one side politically, but what they had done very effectively was find a friction point and then try to manipulate people on both sides. The number one topic was actually Black Lives Matter. They created a fake persona to pretend to be a pro-Black Lives Matter activist and to push narratives that both would maybe radicalize people who are supportive of Black Lives Matter, but also look radical to more moderate people who could say, like, oh, look at these people, they're really nuts. They even, in a couple cases, tried to create protests where a pro-immigration group and an anti-immigration group protest one another by inviting people to events that were at the same time.
Down with the racists! Down with the Nazis!
We were surprised that Putin would care so much about who the next president was, that he was so intent upon damaging me, damaging my campaign, preventing me, if he could, from becoming president. And also how adept they were in sowing disinformation, misinformation. It was unlike anything we'd ever seen.
None of us kind of conceptualized this as the kind of groups we should be looking for.
For anyone who hasn't really focused on this, I'm sure your mouths are open too. David's is closed because he uncovered all this. Yes, thank you, David, for making my day. So, question, the Russian cyber capability is extraordinary. We just saw that. And they are extremely flexible in how they apply their techniques. It's a point you made. So how should we think about what's coming next?
So one way to think about it, Jane, is that there are two kinds of hacks we're trying to protect against, each of which requires very different strategies. One of them is the hacking of infrastructure, our voting infrastructure in 3 weeks from today. Mm-hmm. And the second is the hacking of minds. And that's what you saw happen with the Facebook accounts and so forth. So the hacking of infrastructure is about protecting the voting machines. I'm less worried about them, Jane, because our system is spread out over 50 states. It is so diverse, so discombobulated, so different in each and every place, and so disconnected from the internet that it would be really hard to go hack the machines. It would be a whole lot easier to go hack the registration systems, to hack the e-poll books, so that when you go in to vote in California, Jane, they say, well, wait a minute, we show you listed in Washington, D.C. Or after you send in your absentee ballot, have them say, well, you voted already, even if you hadn't sent in an absentee ballot. So there are all kind of mischief you can do in the registration system, which is a much more public-facing system than the voting machines. Okay, so that's a big concern. Another big concern, ransomware, as we discussed early on, because if you can lock up those systems, then you can cause a lot of havoc. Now, I have to give credit to the Department of Homeland Security and others. I think they've done a really good job in the past year of making the secretaries of state and the different districts aware of this risk, and basically getting them to print out their poll books. And this is a case where you need resilience. If attacked, you've got a backup system that isn't dependent on the computer system. Then there's the hacking of minds, and that's what we saw the Russians doing with Facebook. Well, they're not going to play the same playbook again because Facebook will see them coming and is taking stuff down. So what have they been doing? They've been moving to US servers instead of the Internet Research Agency. Why? Because they know the NSA and Cyber Command and other intelligence agencies can't legally operate in the United States. What have they been doing on the influence side? they're not sending out as many of these fake personas, but they are amplifying messages that they are hearing and putting them into the minds of real Americans with real First Amendment rights and getting them to go amplify them. And they've had a lot of help in this from President Trump, because every time President Trump gets out and says this election is rigged, you can't trust the mail-in voting system, the Russians take that message and they amplify it again.
So are we blaming this all on the Russians? I mean, and Trump, or are there other foreign and non-state actors? And let me just put one other thing out there that I learned yesterday, I guess it was. The Republican Party in California, that has a nice ring to it since I do vote there, and I have voted by mail, and I've also taken out some kind of gizmo where I can track my letter to be sure it actually reached the right place. But, which I think is, thank you, California, for that. But the Republican Party admitted in California to putting out fake ballot collection boxes around the state. This happened yesterday, and the Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, was on the airwaves saying how horrible it was. They have to take them down. But doesn't this act by whomever make everyone doubt whether depositing a ballot, even in a ballot box that says official California, ballot box, is doing the is casting an effective vote?
That's right. And so the Republicans have said they're going to take the ballots that go into those ballot boxes, largely in Republican districts, and turn them in as paper ballots to be counted. But the Secretary of State in California has said it's actually a felony to go create what looks to be a ballot box that isn't.
You'd think.
That's a pretty low-tech way to get at this issue. But I think you've raised, the fundamental question here, which is the issue is not as much affecting the election as affecting people's confidence that their ballot will be counted. And that's why it's great that California is tracking your vote. And in DC, where I'm registered to vote, they track votes. New York State has no online way of tracking your mail-in ballot. Several other states do not.
Right.
And my view is, if Amazon can tell you when you order a pair of socks, when it's left the warehouse and when it's on a truck and when it was dropped at your door, how hard can this be with the fundamental instrument of a democracy, right? It's inexcusable that we can't track every ballot every step of the way while still keeping who you voted for secret, right?
Well, we're in violent agreement, as we say at the Wilson Center. But the other part of my question was, we can't blame all this on Russia, right?
Absolutely not. And, one of the things about the Russian hack in 2016 is that every successful hack is a learning experience for every other actor in the world, right? And, sitting in my office at Wilson 2 years ago, or a little more than 2 years ago, working on the book, we started counting how many countries had, in our view, a sophisticated cyber capability.
Right.
And the number then was about 35 that Elisa Sabanius, who was working with me at Wilson, and I came up with. Now, remember, there are only 9 states that have nuclear weapons now, and we dropped the atomic bomb 75 years ago. So in a decade, we've gotten 35 sophisticated states, probably more. The Iranians have began to show up in the 2018 election, looking at influence operations. The Chinese are getting better and better at this. They haven't shown up in the US, but they've been elsewhere. And so, this is fairly inexpensive knowledge.
And you don't worry about our talking about some of this stuff, or you writing about some of this stuff as a way to tip off bad guys to hurt good guys?
Quite the contrary. I think that the problem with our cyber policy so far is that we have wrapped so much of it in secrecy that we've actually allowed a lot of this to flourish. Oh. And by our failure to announce with great specificity what we can detect and how we will respond, I think has actually stepped on our deterrent effect. Now, It is interesting that when we went out and reported 2 days ago that Cyber Command had been behind this move against TrickBot, you didn't hear a lot of protests coming up out of Fort Meade. And I think they are beginning to learn their lesson. The Trump administration did name the Russians as the group behind the NotPetya attacks. It named the North Koreans as the group behind the WannaCry attacks, which took out the British healthcare system. So we are getting a little bit better at coming up with sort of public attribution. But I actually think we have to reverse our thinking and say that all cyber data is actually presumed to be public, and then have to make the case to classify a tiny little sliver of it. And part of the reason for that is some of the best information is coming from outside the US government. It's coming from Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Apple. And they're the ones I call when I see a big attack unfolding, not the NSA.
So I actually find that very interesting, since back in the day when I was a politician, as you point out, I'm a recovering politician, and I'm soon to be a recovering think tank CEO. I thought we overclassified everything. And a lot of it was done to protect against embarrassment or protect turf. And it was highly unuseful. And that prevented us from sharing crucial information with first responders, for example, in terms of threats to the homeland. But let me go to 3 brilliant questions from some of our audience here and see what you think. Number 1, is the US underreacting to cyber events because we are just as guilty of similar attacks and don't want to tie our hands? How can we change that thinking?
It's a great question. So you mentioned a little bit of this in discussing Ben Buchanan's The Cybersecurity Dilemma. So think about this. When we see code that we don't understand and we know has come from abroad in our utility system, we freak out and say, oh my goodness, the Russians are going to turn off all the power, in Chicago. And when we put our own code into a foreign system, we say, no, we're just preparing the battlefield and conducting better surveillance.
Yeah.
So of course, to the Russians, when we're in their system, it looks just like what they're doing inside ours. And that's why you want to go in and announce it, right? You want to say, yeah, we've got our code in and we can put it in anytime you want. But it's here for a very specific purpose and a very specific deterrent purpose, right? The second element of this is that we seem to be unwilling as a nation to put together a sort of cyber code of conduct. Joe Nye and others have talked about the need to be able to go do this. And the reason for that is that we don't want, and our intelligence agencies and the Pentagon don't want to limit any future presidents or current presidents' choices if under attack. So we don't want to say, oh, the electric grid is off the table in peacetime. The election system of a foreign country is off the table. But if we're not willing to sign up, then no one else will be either. And we've got to get past that problem, which we've been churning on for years now.
So, second question, what is the biggest barrier or gap in knowledge from a policy perspective that education and outreach could help with in the fight against disinformation?
So the key to all of this is questioning what the source is, right? So, my kids grew up knowing you don't just say at the dinner table, oh, I read it on the internet, because it might be an unpleasant reaction from dad. But it's the same thing about making people understand that there's a difference in what you read in Breitbart News, which is taking other news events and twisting it into something that you read in the New York Times or see on CNN that comes out of a deep reporting from a real reporting staff. So we've got to get people to be able to distinguish from first grade on what the source of the information is and what was involved in gathering it. And then how to go test that information before you hit the retweet button. How you stop and you sort of say, how can I find out if this is true? And you're seeing the beginning of that in what Facebook and Twitter are doing as they take posts, sometimes from leading American politicians, and say, we're letting you see this, but go get educated about fraud and mail-in ballots. And here's where you can go for some real information. The difficulty here is that what we've learned is if you give people a piece of information that you tell them is real and you give them a piece that is salacious but false, guess which one they're likely to go retrieve?
No question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just to be fair and balanced, there are other, imagine this, David, it's a thought experiment. There are other newspapers besides the Post and the Times that sometimes offer interesting and accurate information. I would put out there maybe the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, a few periodicals like The Economist, and et cetera. Just as a thought.
You're absolutely right, but to the minds of those who are trying to segregate out the information here, what they want to say is, oh, they're all the same. They're actually all in the pocket of, the U.S. government, which is laughable if you consider the right. Or they're all the product of the same group of elites who are trying to protect a power center. And so the mere conspiracy theories that get wrapped around it are used to impugn the content.
I totally agree. But a whole bunch of people, sadly now, and even people we know well, because I keep getting emails from all kinds of folks attaching some article that is salacious, are susceptible to that. And I'll just add one postscript. I remember being told as a baby candidate in the 90s that a negative ad penetrates twice as fast as a positive ad. It's the same point. And, therefore hit the other guy or say something, there's no truth in advertising as we are witnessing in this election. Hit the other guy or claim something that may be false, but it's negative, and people will pay more attention to you. I didn't do that. I think I never did that. I did the comparative ad. I'm for this and she is for that. But everybody's doing that these days, or most everybody's doing that these days. Just look at the airwaves. So, this stuff, you're right, is our minds, sadly, not yours personally, and not your kids, because you're obviously a very devoted and careful father, but most people's minds are susceptible, and it's very dangerous. So, third question, is China building a global IT infrastructure in an attempt to control the system by owning the system and its norms?
Well, pretty close. So it's a great question, because the strategy being pursued by the Russians and by the Chinese is completely different, right? The Russians cruise the Atlantic and parts of the Pacific with these big submarines that basically have giant scissors in front of them to make the point that if they wanted to cut us off, they could cut 160 undersea cables that would black out, American internet service. And so, talk about the ultimate hack, it's hack the cables, right? What are the Chinese doing? They're laying cable like mad. And then when they pop up in Africa, Europe, elsewhere, they say, hey, not only do we have the undersea cable capability for you, here's an inexpensive 5G package for you. And if you buy it today, and just this week, we will throw in for absolutely free the facial recognition system that we use so effectively in Hong Kong to identify dissidents and throw them in jail. Would you be interested, Mr. Orban? Right? And we haven't quite figured out, we know what we're doing to counter the Russians in some ways. We haven't really figured this part out. And that's really what's behind the whole argument about 5G infrastructure. Now, let's say, Jane, that we won the argument and that Mike Pompeo was completely successful and got every one of the European allies to reject a Huawei system. As we wrote in the Wilson Quarterly, in an article I did with Mary Brooks, who was also an associate producer of the documentary here, even then, the Chinese would have about 40% or more of the world's networks under their control. So we can't live in the fantasy that by cutting off Huawei and blocking TikTok, we are somehow going to stop the Chinese from having a good part of this infrastructure. What we need to think about is, what are the dangers of having a splintered internet, a sort of techno-democratic internet and a techno-authoritarian internet? And that worries me.
So my impression is that a few people, even in addition to you, David, now agree with this proposition and think we're much worse off to have try to have two completely separate communication systems, if we could even pull it off. And we, the United States and our friends, are building more capacity to see whether we could, for example, expand on the software piece of 5G, where we're really good. And maybe this is don't laugh if I'm embarrassing myself. Expand on the software piece of 5G, where we're really good and where we might be able to dominate, and then try through a coalition and some good luck and the right strategies with the Chinese to build something where we can protect ourselves against inappropriate Chinese activity, know when that's happening, but also dominate in certain parts of this.
No, you got it exactly right. And that's the most promising idea about how to go compete with them, because you're not going to compete with them by blocking them out, right? And Italy went about signing up with Huawei. They're a NATO member the last time I checked, right? Yeah. They're now rethinking the wisdom of that, but they went ahead and did it. What we need to be able to offer, as you say, is a software package that will work on anything. Basically, you'd have a white box that would be your switching system. And then the software can be dominated by really good American or European-led coalitions. And that's the best way to deal with Huawei is to compete with it technologically. And right now, we've been remarkably unorganized on that. The United States got out of the business by and large, and the two European competitors, Nokia and Ericsson, aren't quite big enough to go handle the Huawei onslaught.
Well, I'm pleased that I sort of kind of got in the right direction.
No, you're in just the right spot. Yeah.
I don't want to run out of time. I think we have time to see the third clip, and I'd love everyone to see it, and I'd love to see it before we close, and hopefully there'll be one more question about that. So let's do the third clip.
"16 hours since the Iowa caucuses began. We're still waiting for the result."
The app didn't work. No one knew if it would.
This is so far not so good.
Iowa was exactly my worst fear.
The biggest concern was that voters would not be able to trust the system.
What about the confidence in the vote?
Especially against the backdrop of the Russian interference in 2016.
What Iowa is demonstrating to adversaries in the United States is all they have to do is create that appearance, and they probably don't even have to create their own disinformation. American partisans will do it for them.
The president's son was saying it's rigged. The president's campaign manager, the Biden campaign, is out there openly saying they don't trust what the results will be.
They've created what's called a perception hack. Our mind immediately goes to the question, are the Russians messing with our election? It doesn't matter whether they are or they aren't.
This is one of the confusing aspects of election security. It's not just about trying to hack into computers. There's another aspect of election interference that's about trying to hack into your brain. They're ultimately trying to get the American people to lose confidence in the system, that the system is beyond repair, that the system is broken, and their vote doesn't matter.
U.S. officials have now told Senator Bernie Sanders that Russia is trying to help his presidential campaign.
How did you think it came out now if you had the briefing a month ago?
Well, I'll let you guess about one day before the Nevada caucus. Why do you think it came out? Was the Washington Post? Good friends.
Joe, what do you say to the Russians?
They're continuing to meddle. They're involved in this race and in my primary. They're involved going after me on Facebook. They've already been taken down because Putin knows me and I know him, and he doesn't want me to be president.
The Russians want everyone in this country to mistrust everything. Whether or not the Russians are involved, these next few months are going to be tense.
Okay, so for our final minutes, as we're kind of picking ourselves up off the floor, David, you scared us to death. This documentary is fantastic. I have to watch it. I hope somebody will tell us when it's going to be shown, and you will tell us. But in thinking about this latest little soundbite, the perception hack, what is hopeful about this that people like me could cling to in the next 3 weeks, plus the counting of the late absentee ballots and the rest of it, to imagine that we will get to the other side with a declared winner who actually won the election.
So what the hopeful news out here, Jane, is that we're all braced for a perception hack, okay? Perception hack means you don't have to hack into every registration system in Wisconsin or Minnesota or Pennsylvania or whatever battleground state you have in mind here. You just have to get into a few of them and create enough chaos. Now, the Iowa case from the Iowa caucuses didn't involve the Russians hacking into anything. We actually managed to mess that up all by ourselves by putting in some new software to put the caucuses together that people rushed together, didn't test out, and the test became caucus day. That's a really bad moment to be basically test flying a new system, right? And we saw the dangers. We're going to see some bad things happen on election day, because on every election day, some bad things are happening. Hurricanes happen, power outages happen, people lose ballots, people lose data. And it's a reason that it's good that we're going now to have at least 92% of the ballots will have some paper associated with it, which gives you a chance to sort of catch up. And that's up significantly, about 10% from 2016. The trick for me and my colleagues in the media is going to be to figure out what a perception hack is. What's just an innocent mistake? What's a bureaucratic snafu? What's the Russians meddling in a couple of places, but not in enough to make a difference? And then how to go deal with the inevitable conspiracy charges that will come out of that.
Right. Well, I think we're about out of time, but I just would point out, I'm thinking this to myself too. We survived hanging chads. That's not a country. That is a mistake in a ballot organization. And we had to deal with the consequences of that, which went to the US Supreme Court. We are now kind of having that conversation again. I've joined the board of a bipartisan group called Every Vote Counts, which is counseling America to be patient, that elections may not be over on election night. We've had small mistakes before, but the only point I would make, David, and I do hear you, that the media is more sophisticated and that we're all going to survive this, is that the level of capability, the capability on the bad side is much higher. That many governments have an agenda to sow disinformation here, and maybe they had less of an agenda, maybe they didn't, but I think they had, and that we are so divided as a nation that this is kind of the perfect, not just the perfect weapon, but the perfect storm. That's an old cliche, but it is. And so I want you to promise me something, and here it is. One, you're coming back to the Wilson Center. I mean, you have to. I mean, who else is your family? And two, that you will somehow use all of your enormous capacity to get us through the 2020 election, get a winner declared. I mean, it's not all up to you, I understand that, but help all of us who are so invested in this democracy, flawed as it is, and want so much for the United States to have a chance to do better. And that includes understanding all this better. And you just have a huge role to play because the Wilson Center says you do, but also you've earned it, my friend. And when you get the Academy Award, I want you to clutch it and say, I want to thank my family, including the Wilson family, for this award. So that's
thank you, Jane, and thank you for doing this. It's a big challenge for everybody. I mean, all Americans, but journalists included in that, to go make sure that we all understand what's happened in this election. You know, we've been running elections in the United States since 1788. We've, by and large, run them pretty cleanly. It's a key element of the American democracy, and it's got to be one going forward. For those who want to get ready for it by seeing the whole film, it's on HBO at 8 p.m. on Friday, but it's downloadable thereafter on HBO at your leisure. So you can see it starting Friday.
And the title is?
The Perfect Weapon.
And do we need any more information to download it or find it or whatever?
Yeah, you might need an HBO subscription, but you know, people will figure that out. Yeah. Right.
Well, thank you, my friend. You did hear me about coming back to the center. Did you?
I,
Did you
you
say
know,
yes?
I'm gonna
Did I hear a
save.
yes?
I'm gonna save the electronic record of this and come back to you with it. Yeah.
Well, I may not be there, but my ghost will be floating around and will welcome you yet again. So, David, thank you for your enormous contribution to what can I say, to a world that understands itself better and a more informed populace. I mean, tell your kids I said that. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you, and thank you, Jane, and thanks everyone at Wilson who helped make writing the book possible.
Take care. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.